Let's go. Hey, so everyone that can read the slides knows I'm Derek Weeks. I'm Vice President at Sonatype. I'm also co-founder of All Day DevOps, the Star Wars figures out there in the lobby. For any of you that have dropped by, Mark Miller here in the hat is the other co-founder, in case you're wondering who the other half of that crew is. I'm super excited to have you guys here today. One is because I was given like the last session before the keynote and the happy hour, and I figured there was going to be like 4 people in the room, including myself. So to have a crowd on the last day of Jenkins World is awesome. This afternoon in this presentation, we're going to talk about some work and research I've been doing over the last 5 years within application security, application development, and what wasn't called DevSecOps when we started looking into these elements and issues that we'll walk through, but is now more commonly referred to as DevSecOps practices. On the agenda, Hasan Yasar was supposed to be here with me from Carnegie Mellon. He was called to London, so he wasn't able to be here with me, but he has been a part of this research for the last 3 years as well, so representing some of the analysis that we've been able to do together. So what are we going to talk about here? So part of the findings and the data of what are the attributes of DevSecOps practices that others are doing that you might be doing in your own organization, might want to apply into your organization or begin to think about, come from surveys that we have done across the community. So we have something that we just did earlier this year. It's the 2019 DevSecOps Community Survey. This is the 5th year that we've done the survey, and we've surveyed about 15,000 people across the community, and mainly development community. There are some application or security InfoSec people that participate within this survey, but it's for the most part DevOps and development community that we talk about in this survey. Now, while I'm at Sonatype, this is a community survey, as the name says. Cloudbased, Carnegie Mellon, Signal Sciences, Twistlock, 9th Bit, and others from the community have helped us in terms of promoting the survey of we want people to go out and take the survey, which is why this year we had 5,500 people participate in the survey. But we're also not the only ones that develop the survey and come up with the questions. So we do a lot of outreach to different thought leaders within the community. We reach out to some of the analysts at Gartner and Forrester and IDC that we work with to ask questions that they want to know of the community. Sometimes we can name those people, sometimes we can't because their firms say that they're not allowed to participate in unsanctioned activities. But it's not just us making up these questions, because while Sonatype does play into some parts of DevSecOps and the commercial and free tools that we have, we didn't want to have a survey that was so Sonatype oriented that it just felt like it's a vendor pitch with different data. So for anyone in here, I'm going to tell you at the end how to get a hold of the survey and some of the other report data that we're going to talk about. But my email address up here, weeks@sonatype.com. I have an out-of-office message that is on today. If you just email that, no subject line, no text needed unless you want to put something in those fields, it will send you an auto-reply message that will give you the 2019 survey. It will also give you a 2019 State of the Software Supply Chain report. These are on SlideShare, so you can download them as PDFs. And I also put a couple of other helpful links in there. I'll put that up at the end of the presentation as well for anyone that wants to get copies. Most of the slides that I'm going to present here are in the reports itself, so I'm not giving you the slide deck, but if you read the surveys, you're going to get most of the images as well. So first of all, before we get into what are the practices, I want to tell you a little bit about who participated to give you a feel of the population that we're talking to. So for the most part, we are talking to technology companies or banking and financial services companies. This has been typical of the survey for a number of years as we've done it. But we also hit on insurance, manufacturing, healthcare, and a lot of other industries within this to get a cross-representation of participation here. Now this one is really important. Of course, there are different people with different roles that are informing the survey. But the really important thing as we go through, and I'll continue to refer back to this, is that, and I said this at the beginning, people that self-describe themselves as DevOps professionals or developers or architects, these are the people that are making up the majority of the responses here. And while we are talking about security-related elements, you'll see that security people were only 4% of the overall survey. So yes, there is an influence, but it's not a heavy influence. So we'll talk about if you were a security person, you probably would have answered this way. But because we're talking to developers, we're seeing them answering different ways throughout that. So it's interesting when we begin to see some of the patterns through the answers. So one of the things that I found interesting year after year in doing this survey is we asked this question about how important is security to you, and do you have time to work on this? And developers consistently, year after year, and I'm not sure why we have such a strong match on the percentages year after year, but come back and say, yeah, I know security is important, but I don't have time to spend on it, right? So everyone wants to do it. Do I have enough time to do it? Is it part of my practice? And what you're going to see is that as we've advanced in our practices across the industry, I don't have more time to spend on it, but I am doing more of it because of the practices that are being implemented. So it's not a matter of, hey, developers, you're not doing security. You need to block off a day a week or half a day a week to do more security-related stuff. We actually need to figure out ways to make you more productive with your current practices that integrate security as part of your daily routine where you're actually not doing a lot more security work. It's just happening behind the scenes, or it's coming to you through different practices within your organization. So to set some of the dynamic up within the survey responses, we did ask people to, again, self-qualify. What stage are you within your DevOps adoption? So 25% or 27% said, we have a mature practice. And this was either across their entire organization or in the silo of the organization where they work. Then we had about 50% that were somewhere in the middle. We're trying to get there. We're trying to make practice, but we're not mature yet. And then 25% immature practices. And these are the agile or waterfall shops that just aren't there yet, maybe have a desire to go there someday, but self-qualifying as we don't have a DevOps practice. So what we've done throughout this, and you'll see some of the comparisons, is we look at this group's behavior against this group's behavior. And then for the most part, we're not going to talk so much about this middle area here, just to see the contrast within some of the responses. So the first element here where we went out and talked to people is we wanted to know, where are you applying automated security practices or application security practices across your development lifecycle? Now, the important thing here, again, is I said we're looking at kind of the elite DevOps practices versus no DevOps practices. So the elites in blue and the no DevOps practices in red. Now, as part of this, what we see is that certainly the DevOps practices have more occurrences of automated security across the development lifecycle, in the development lifecycle. And when we're thinking about shifting left within the development lifecycle, we're seeing more investment in activity across these organizations than we are in those with no DevOps practices. On the right side here, the throughout the practice or implementing automated security throughout the practice is 350% greater across the lifecycle in mature DevOps organizations versus those without mature organizations. Now, to be very clear about this data and what it says is I don't want anyone in this room interpreting, oh, these blue columns where people are doing more integrated automated security and CI and build, maybe in their Jenkins platform, or where we're bringing it earlier into IDEs and GitHub and the design and architecture elements, that we're doing all security. We have every kind of automated security, and we're bringing that into the design stage, and that this represents a perfect form of security. What you have to interpret this is someone is trying to do automated security of some form earlier in the life cycle. It doesn't say, I've perfected this. It doesn't say, we're using everything that we can at that stage. They've introduced some form of security in this. So as I was talking to some folks earlier in the day about, there are truths within this data, there are lies within this data, and there's this objective or aspiration of perfection within this data. Don't look at this as, and try and bring this back to your organization to say, see how perfect these guys are in blue that have this elite DevSecOps practice and we need to get there too? You can have a tool like Sonatype or Twistlock or Fortify or Veracode or whoever out there, any of the free tools from OWASP to help you do security. But you don't have to use all of their features, and you don't have to perfectly implement all of those, and you don't have to use all of the products to be able to answer yes here. But it's clear that the pattern says that DevOps practices are introducing more forms of security in more places across the development lifecycle. So the pattern of, can people implement security in a DevOps practice? Is that happening? Yes, it's happening. And it's not just happening a little, it's happening a lot within these environments. So the next point that we get to is, if you're implementing automated security, what we wanted to know is, what are you implementing? What kind of tools are you bringing to these practices in these organizations? So we ask about a bunch of different tools within the survey. Now, these are the top 5 that came out of that. So web application firewalls, network-oriented security has been around for a long time, and has been around for a long time ahead of DevOps ever becoming a buzzword, or DevSecOps becoming a buzzword, so that's not a huge surprise. I think anyone that's here that's been to all of the Kubernetes-related sessions or container-related sessions or discussions throughout the week would not be surprised by container security being introduced there. Things like open source governance or open source security. When you're developing with a lot of open source components and they're the majority of your application, yes, I'm going to focus on investing resources there. The static and application, or the static and dynamic analysis, or the SAST and DAST solutions, these are kind of the common typical solutions that are out there today, whether you're doing DevOps or not. These are the longest held traditions outside of network security. So not a lot of big surprises there, but still you'll see that the DevOps practices are usually implementing more of these practices than others. By the way, if anyone has any questions, like, I don't have to go through these slides without you guys are holding questions to the end. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We have plenty of time for questions to be introduced. So this was a really interesting result on the survey. And this is always, it's the fun part of doing surveys, is you can ask a question, but you never know which way the answers are going to show up. And there's also different ways to interpret the data that comes through these. So when we ask about, how are you implementing or how are you approaching cloud-based security? A lot of conversations that I've heard just throughout the community say, we're moving stuff into the cloud, And it's Amazon, Azure, Google, whoever we're using for our platform, they have security practices. And their security practices are really good. And their salespeople are telling us that their security practices are so good that they're better than anything that we have in-house. And they're probably, for the most part, true, because they have lots of money and lots of great people and lots of expertise. But at the same time, when you look at, for the DevOps practices, where they have cloud security in place, yes, a lot of more are relying on the cloud vendor themselves, but the utilization of third-party tools doubles in these environments. They're not saying, let's go to the cloud and let our cloud vendor do all of the security. They're saying, yes, they provide us some protection with these security practices that they have. But I can't do that alone. The elite DevSecOps practices are investing twice as much in cloud-based security technologies as the non-DevOps practices, which I thought it's a pretty dramatic jump between those. And certainly the don't use any technologies are, if we're going to do something, we're going to have technologies in place to support that. So it was pretty interesting to see that come out in the data this year as well. So this is another kind of surprise finding when we started to look at the data and interpret it, is we ask, and again, we're asking developers and DevOps pros, how are you informed about AppSec or InfoSec issues within your environment? We're not asking security people. Security people have security tools that they're using, and the tooling is going to tell them what's going wrong. We're asking the developers what's going on, right? So the interesting thing here, when you look at DevOps versus non-DevOps, you think, hey, when we integrate security with our DevOps practices, we can kind of eliminate that security silo, right? We can have less reliance on the security people to inform us of issues going on. But for those that have DevSecOps practices, they figured out how to embed security folks in their development teams, in their DevOps teams. They sit side by side. The red teams and blue teams are working with the developers together. So there is more of a reliance in DevSecOps practices to say security teams are an important part of the equation. And that doesn't diminish, even as we're investing more and more in automated security tooling as a developer group. But the cool thing here is certainly in the tooling area, the developers are saying, when we have AppSec issues, when we have InfoSec issues, our tools are telling us that there are problems. The developers are not using security tools to tell them about security problems. They're using developer tools that are informing them of development-related security problems. So I'm in GitHub. In GitHub, I'm getting security alerts inside GitHub. I'm using Jenkins, and I'm getting security alerts inside Jenkins. I'm using my Eclipse IDE or Visual Studio, and I'm getting security alerts in that. And yes, it might be a security tool that is feeding that information to my development tool, but it's my development tools that are informing me of these issues, right? So that's an interesting practice or result within the data that we see this disparity between. Remember, I don't have any more time as a developer to spend on security than I did 3 years ago when I took this survey and I was answering these questions, right? I know it's important. I don't have any more time, but my tooling is actually helping me out quite a bit more here. So I'm able to introduce more security. The tooling is able to help me identify security issues that I have so that I can more quickly remediate those. When GitHub is telling me as I'm developing that I have a security issue, I can fix it in my own environment or begin to remediate that issue in my own environment without ever having to talk to the security people or without ever having to send my application to a security group to be analyzed and then get feedback. You're getting very fast feedback loops inside the development tools where people are already using these. So this is another question we ask in the survey. which was how fast are you deploying new changes into production? And I think if you've all read the State of DevOps reports or the DORA reports or read Accelerate and seen the data about DevOps teams are releasing code, thousands of times more frequently than their peers in mature DevOps organizations, we're certainly seeing data that parallels what we're seeing in the different surveys that DORA and others have done across the industry. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One is, yes, in a DevOps practice or continuous delivery practice, we all want to move faster. But at the same time we want to move faster, the adversaries are moving faster. So in research, other research that I've done over the last couple of years, I've seen research from IBM, Gartner, Sonatype itself, where we're seeing the average time between a vulnerability being announced and the vulnerability being, the exploits appearing in the wild, a decade ago was 45 days. The vulnerability is announced, the exploits are appearing. You had 45 days between that vulnerability and the exploit being announced to do something, right? In 2017, the time between the vulnerability being announced and the exploit appearing in the wild was 3 days. In 2018, we're down to 24 hours. In some cases, we're seeing the exploits being baked into things like open source components where malicious code is being injected in at the source at the open source project. And the time between the vulnerability introducing itself in your environment and the exploit being available to the adversaries is 0. They've baked the vulnerabilities into the components that you're using. The guys at Discover yesterday, if you were in their session, they talked about Event Stream, which was sometime in the last year when that came out. But Copay's application was targeted by a hacker that knew this event stream open source component was used in Copay's application. They went and became a committer to the open source project event stream. They injected malicious code that was specifically targeting siphoning cryptocurrencies from the Copay wallets. But they implemented that malicious code injection, put it into the project, Copay downloaded it, put it into their applications and released it, and the hacker was immediately able to attack that system. So not only do we have to think about, are we getting faster, right? And are our tools informing us faster and giving us faster feedback loops, but you have to think about how fast are your adversaries. It's not an internal goal so much of how fast can we release or how fast can we remediate vulnerabilities as they happen. You have an external threat that's probably more important as a metric. So if the adversaries can take advantage of exploits in the wild and start attacking your environment within 72 hours, within 24 hours, and you can't release every 24 hours or every 72 hours with those fixes in place, you are at risk. Right? On March 7th, 2017, the Struts vulnerability was announced, and on March 10th, Equifax was breached. They were breached because they didn't know that they had that vulnerable open source component within their environment. Within 72 hours, they couldn't find it. The adversaries found it before them, and Equifax ended up finding this months later. But it's that window of if your adversaries are faster than your deploy speeds, you are at risk between I'll give you the best scenario, 72-hour window, right? If you're not able to deploy changes in a 72-hour window, every hour after that, your organization is at risk. So don't look at this as just an internal metric when you're thinking about security. So here was this is, again, like fascinating data that you get from these surveys and the ways to go about interpreting it. In this particular case, we asked two related questions. One is, does your organization have an open source governance policy? And then second question is, if you said, yes, we have a policy, we said, do you follow it? Right? So we have the exemplary group and the non-DevOps practices. And the exemplary group say, yes, I have a policy, and yes, I follow it. Now, regardless of what kind of practice it is, an open source governance policy, a network security policy, a secure coding policy of any kind, do you follow this practice? Well, in environments where there's more automation present, where we've already seen these companies are investing more in automated security practices, when developers are learning from their tools, we have security issues, and GitHub or my IDEs or Jenkins or whatever are informing me sooner of security issues within my code, I can fix those faster and I can comply to those policies faster. So security is harder to ignore in these environments where it's automated. When it's automated and you're a developer sitting in GitHub and it tells you some of your code has a vulnerability and you get that information staring in your face because it's been automatically delivered to you, it's hard to ignore, like, yeah, I see that there, but I'm not going to do anything about it. Right? It's really easy to do something about it when you're starting to pick the ingredients that you're building with in these environments. So where automation is coming in, it's harder to ignore, and organizations are able to take more advantage of that. So another practice that we see, this was not part of the survey, and also part of the reason why in my auto-response email I put a link to the 2019 State of the Software Supply Chain report, is I did a developer survey in May of this year with Gene Kim, who wrote the Phoenix Project, and Dr. Stephen McGill. And we asked organizations about how they were updating dependencies within the open source projects that they had as a practice. And what we found out is that organizations, there were two groups. One was organizations that were developing using open source components and the dependencies that is a common practice. What are you doing and how often are you updating? We also looked at 36,000 open source projects and looked at how often are they updating their dependencies. And what we found out is that organizations that were updating, right, were upgrading their dependencies, 80% of their dependencies with every release they were doing were delivering more secure versions of their applications and of the code that they were releasing because of this practice. Now, the cool thing about this survey that we did was we were asking them, are you scheduling updates of your dependencies? Do you have some process in place to update dependencies? Do you have automated tools that are helping you update these dependencies within your environment? And where these things were taking place, and they were taking place 10 times more likely in the exemplar groups that we had identified through the survey data, they were 3.2 or 2.6 times less likely to consider updating components as onerous or painful within their environments, or updating dependencies when a vulnerability was found in one of these and I needed to update it. And the interesting thing about this is where the activity in these groups was normal, I'm going to update my dependencies as a regular facet or a regular practice of my development efforts. When I'm doing this every single day, it's easier, and I'm actually happier about the work that I'm doing. I'm more satisfied. We asked the developers in this survey, are you more satisfied, or are you satisfied with your work? And they gave us ratings, but the people that were doing these things often were actually happier about the work that they were doing, right? So you can imagine if you're climbing this mountain every single day, climbing the mountain is really easy. If you haven't updated your dependencies in a year or 2 years, and then I tell you, you need to update 80% of your dependencies in this release to the latest version, you're going to freak out, right? Why? Because that's going to be hard as heck, right? And it's going to take you a long time to do it. So these same things that we're seeing in like release faster, release often, update your code to the newest versions of things, have an impact. When it's part of a regular practice or regular exercise, when you're doing things that impact security on a regular, frequent basis, it's not hard to do. It just becomes part of standard practice. When you do security checks once a month or once a year or twice a year, it's really hard. Or when you throw an application to a security team after you've built it, and they spend 2 weeks analyzing it and throw it back at you with all these issues that you need to fix, but your release deadline is like tomorrow, right? Then you're freaking out because this practice is a lot harder to deal with. So it's really interesting when you see this data come back that the more frequent and regular capabilities that we see come through the survey. So the other thing that we were noticing as part of the data in the supply chain report was we were looking at applications that were developed and how old the components were, open source components were, binaries were within these applications. And we noticed, no surprise, that most of the components, or 50% of the components, were developed between, or the versions that were in use were released between 2017 and 2019. So the components, or the parts that are being used to assemble the software application, are new. Now, when we did an analysis of the security vulnerabilities associated with those components, what you see, and we've seen this year over year in our studies, is that the newer components have fewer vulnerabilities, and the older ones have a higher percentage of vulnerabilities. And the newest components have the lowest percentage of vulnerabilities. In fact, so this looks like it's about 3% versus the 15% average up there, right? And now you're saying, if you know anything about why this is true, and I have my opinion, which I'll throw out there, but I think this is kind of an obvious one. A component that was just released today or last week hasn't been out long enough to have security researchers identify vulnerabilities in them, right? And those that have been out for a long time have had more people look at them and more eyeballs on them and more chance to identify vulnerabilities. And once a vulnerability is identified in a component that was released 3 years ago, well, maybe that's actually the same as the 20 releases before it have the same vulnerability in it. So these components get implicated more often the longer they're out. So components age like milk, not wine, as is often said. But if you go back to the mountain chart and you think about, if I'm updating 80% of my dependencies in the binaries that I'm using with every release that I'm doing, right, then you're actually staying in this group here, right, of I'm using the latest versions of components that are available, and just by that fact alone, you're not actually like doing something that's like a security tool or security practice. You're just using the latest version, which, by the way, the latest versions are usually the best versions because the projects that are updating these say, hey, it had a performance bug, right? It had a usability issue, right? It didn't have the APIs that people wanted or the integration points that people wanted in it, right? So we're improving the versions. We're not releasing new components that have worse features than all the 40 versions we've released so far. So you're getting better functionality by updating your dependencies, and you're actually maintaining a better security posture because of it without actually doing a security thing. You're just getting the benefits of newer components have fewer vulnerabilities as a practice within your environment. So it's kind of cool to be able to see how that climbing the mountain practice can marry up to what's in your applications. So going back to the survey data, this was again really interesting when you think about who the audience is. If you ask security people, why are we doing security? Why do we have network security and application security and all this? And they're like, we're at risk. There are adversaries out there attacking us. This is a risk problem. I am trying to help prevent this organization from being attacked and us being breached and what have you. But when we're asking developers, certainly risk management was at the top of the answers here. But 1 in 4 are saying it's not necessarily about security. Security is just an attribute of quality, right? I want to release the best quality software possible, and I'm using automated security practices to improve the quality of what I'm delivering, not so much as a risk issue. Now, this was the first year that we asked this question that Hasan had introduced to the survey, so I don't have multi-year view on that, but in the next year survey, we'll introduce this again to see if there's any change here or if these kind of remain consistent within the answers. So another part to think about is, okay, so we have more security practices within our organization, or we're aspiring to use more automated security practices across the development lifecycle. And we're making more information available to our developers in the tooling so that they can make better decisions and improve the quality of this. But what are we doing from a training category? How much are we investing in training and secure coding practices within organizations? So the good news is that for mature DevOps organizations, only 11% get no training. In the less mature DevOps organizations, it's a third of the organizations have no training. So you can't just say, hey, we bought you tools, we integrated tools. There's got to be some training that comes along with it. And yeah, it doesn't have to be, spend a month in a class and do this, but take advantage of trying to figure out where can we get more knowledge, where can we share more knowledge, where can we bring our security teams in to maybe help educate us. Who on our security teams was actually a developer in their past life that can come in and work with us and get more secure practices within our development practices. And I think that's what you see really between the differences here. Because remember, in the mature DevOps organizations, those people are saying, I find out about security issues more from my security teams. It was a little bit higher on the mature DevOps organization saying, we rely on our security teams to find out about issues. Well, they're working more with those people to say, we want to integrate more knowledge and practice within our organizations. So this was probably the biggest surprise answer within the survey for me when we said, do you have a cybersecurity incident response plan in place? So regardless, if I didn't have this slide up here to show you the answers between the two organizations, if you went out and asked someone when you're reading the headlines every day and you're seeing breach and breach and breach and breach and the latest big breach somewhere, and someone says, do you have a plan in place if you ever got breached? And you go to any organization, you'd hope that 100% would say, of course. It's inevitable that we're going to be breached. We've been breached and we probably don't even know it. But we need a plan on what do we do, right? But still, even in the elite practices, 1 in 5 this is again, the development side. If you ask the security people, probably 100% would have said yes. But from the development team perspective, they're like, I don't know. I literally don't know if we have a response plan in place if we get breached. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but it just seems like in the world where we live, security is a primary concern of a lot of organizations, that we should have an idea of being breached, or an idea of do we have a plan in place. So this I'm just throwing in here because it was a cool anti-pattern that you see within the data. So we ask organizations, we'd ask them, have you had or have you experienced a web application breach? Have you had or experienced an open source related breach in the last 12 months? So the interesting thing was in these mature DevOps organizations, it wasn't that they were being breached more. It's that they were actually more aware that they were breached versus the non-DevOps practices. They're like, hey, we're cool. Remember there was I won't name names, but a huge hotel chain that I'm staying at right across the street there. And they announced that they were breached, but they had been breached 3 years ago and just figured it out. right? It's like that kind of process is the 21% versus the DevOps practices that are more aware, like, we're being breached, right? So that awareness was kind of an interesting thing to see. When I first saw it, I'm like, no, this can't be. I mean, if you're investing all this, money and time and automated security and education and incident response plans and things, like, clearly the breach numbers are going to be a lot lower in this group. And I saw, like, how can I publish this? Because it just refutes it just throws all the other data in the trash, right? But when I went out and talked to more people about it in the industry, they're like, no, it's the knowledgeable versus the ignorant, over in this category. So really cool to see the data. So the one thing that I'll say from this, hopefully, it was weeks at sonatype.com if you want a copy of the survey and the supply chain report that has, I didn't cover all of the questions from the survey within this, so there are more responses there that you can look at in terms of practices. The really important thing about all of this is, the data is interesting, right? And hopefully somewhat entertaining, and you got some knowledge from this conversation. But what I really want you to do is take the file, right, of the survey, share it with your team, schedule a lunch, schedule coffee in the morning, and say, let's look at this. Like, what practices do we have? What practices do we want to aspire to within our organization? What things are others doing that we're not doing that we could be doing, right? This is not, hey, we ran this data, here are the results. It's the start of a conversation point with your colleagues or your environment, your peers, to say, what are we doing and what could we do better? Right? That's really why we do the survey. That's really where you're going to get value in the survey, and looking at what other people are doing and what might help with a vision or a roadmap for what your own organization could do. I'll also just, another quick mention, all-day DevOps. I mentioned that myself and Mark were the co-founders of that. If you didn't get a chance to hear about it, it's really simple. We built a conference for all of your colleagues that couldn't be here, right? So I've met tons of people from big and small organizations where they're like, we have 100 or 200 or 2,000 people back at the office that can't afford to fly to San Francisco, buy a ticket for Jenkins World, stay in a hotel, and whatnot, because it's simply unaffordable for any scale organization to do that. We built this conference. It's November 6th. This is our 4th year doing it. It's all online. It's all free. We have 150 sessions. It's all practitioner-led. We allow absolutely no vendor pitches as part of the agenda. Free online and November 6th. So sign up, sign your teams up, schedule a conference room, watch together. There's a Q&A channel on Slack. Last year we had 30,000 people participate in this in our 4th year, and we're looking to have similar numbers again this year. So it's a cool way to get knowledge and not be vendor pitched through a conference, because no one wants to. I don't want to show up and talk about Sonatype products for a half an hour. That would be, someone at our organization does that, but not me. Thank you all. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask now, or I'm around as well. But thank you very much.